Welcome back, party people. Mike here with the Social Life of Language, and today we are looking at Undoing Appropriateness, Raciolinguistic Ideologies and Language Diversity in Education by Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, an article that's going to be cited for a very long time. Now, this piece is pretty complex, so this is going to be a multi-part video, each one looking at a key concept. This video is going to focus on the white listening subject, and on the next video, that one will be focused on raciolinguistic ideologies specifically. Now, I know you might be here for that really cool looking term, raciolinguistic ideologies, but let me tell you, if you really understand what the white listening subject is first, understanding the raciolinguistic ideology part comes way easier. Now, a lot of writing has been inspired by this work, so I'm going to take an unusual step. I'm going to go back to 2015 when this article was published and talk about it from there, from that point in time. So to keep us on track, and as an opening note, I want to focus quickly on a phrase Flores and Rosa use, a raciolinguistic perspective. Now, there's tons of work on race and tons of work on language, even tons of work on race and language. But in my opinion, what makes this approach so special is the last word, perspective, which makes us think of words like perception and interpretation, because we see, we listen, we interpret, we perceive what is happening from specific vantage points. And those vantage points are not only based on individual feelings and self-interest, but those ideas, those modes of perception are inherited from our social histories. In this article, Flores and Rosa critique how it has been customary in American education to believe that it was the school's job to supposedly fix speakers with broken language, or to correct students who engage in inappropriate linguistic behaviors, where we try to fix some mythical linguistic deficiency that supposedly many, if not most, non-white identified speakers suffered from. We have since began to call that set of white supremacist beliefs the deficit perspective, or the deficiency perspective. And it's a phrase we will use a million times in these videos. Now, a big problem is that it appears whenever Black and brown folks speak, the appropriateness of their language use is always put into question. It is never formal enough, never respectful enough. Now look, when you perceive Black and brown people as always speaking inappropriately, or as automatically linguistically broken or linguistically deficient in some way, doesn't that sound a little, white supremacy-ish? Well, remember, many people subscribe to the ideological belief that language and race are totally separate, unrelated concepts, which makes it easy for a person to say racist things about the way someone talks while simultaneously claiming they're not referring to the person, just the way they talk. Now, in this article, Flores and Rosa are going to say something a lot of folks thought was a bit shocking. They were like, maybe there's something wrong in the way we've been trained to listen, how we've been trained to hear and then assess language abilities through a deficit perspective, where we assume there's always something inappropriate or broken in the linguistic practices of Black and brown students. And we gotta know as teachers and as educators that sometimes we get to be very powerful actors. We get to listen, we get to judge, and some of us literally get to grade students on their so-called appropriateness of language use. Flores and Rosa are gonna change it up. And this is perhaps one of the main points of the article. They're gonna say that the problem isn't located in the speakers, or what they call the speaking subject, but perhaps it is us, the listeners, who get to judge those speakers, or what they call the listening subject. To put it bluntly, it's one thing to listen to a speaker and hear difference, as in you hear a British accent and somehow you know that sounds different. Maybe it makes you sound smart or whatever. But it's another thing to listen to a brown speaker's accent and hear difference that you automatically connect with deficiency and inappropriateness. Unfortunately, many of us do not realize that the idea of linguistic deficiency has a deeply racist history. The assumed linguistic deficiency of Black and brown folks is an assertion we inherited from white supremacist doctrine, which included folks like colonial administrators, researchers, and Christian missionaries, all perceiving specific folks as lacking civility or hygiene or intelligence or real language, etc. Now back then, when these colonial linguists were the listeners or the listening subjects, they immediately made judgments. Maybe they would say, those folks over there do not have real language. And well, if you lack real language, then clearly you must lack intelligence. That kind of thinking quickly becomes a feedback loop. Why do they lack intelligence? Well, because they lack real language. Why do they lack real language? Well, because they lack intelligence. If you haven't watched my video on the biography of the deficiency perspective, that video will help you understand raciolinguistic ideologies even better. So be sure to do that right after this video. Flores and Rosa are pointing to this racist deficiency perspective that we have inherited from society and from history. Then they gave the actors who use this perspective a name, a very specific kind of listener who listens from the point of view similar to those old colonists and white supremacists, what they call the white listening subject, who perceives racialized speakers as different, inferior, deficient, when compared to idealized white linguistic norms. And here's the twist and the painful reality. You don't gotta be white identified to enact the role of the white listening subject, which means any of us can accidentally become white listening subjects. That means me. That even means you, the viewer, and you might not even know it's happening. So, on to today's question. Who or what is the white listening subject? Let's find out. Okay, so as usual, I'm gonna present things in very small bites, and there's certain ideas that I'm gonna leave out early in this video and come back to later when we get more and more complex. I want to start with a statement from our authors. We use a raciolinguistic perspective to examine the ways that discourses of appropriateness are complicit in normalizing the reproduction of the white gaze by marginalizing the linguistic practices of language minoritized populations in US society. We'll come back to that idea of appropriateness in just a bit, but let's start with something called the white gaze. So first, the word gaze is a metaphor for vision, as in gazing upon something. A specific gaze, in other words, is a way to see the world, but more specifically, it is a mode of perception that interprets. It perceives the world in a specific way using all the ideological beliefs that are built into that perspective. For example, we've heard of the male gaze perspective. An example of a male gaze statement would be, women are too emotional to be president. So that is an ideology or set of beliefs about the inferiority of women, which, and the second part is important, by complaining about the inferiority of women, the statement also simultaneously implies the superiority of men. Note how the male gaze benefits men. Clearly, this is a sexist and misogynist perspective, a specifically male gaze mode of perception. Clearly, these ideas have been inherited from previous sexist and misogynist political eras, where we can assume that males were quite literally the folks in power. But also remember, in our recent American elections with women presidential candidates, there were plenty of woman-identified persons who also claimed that women are too emotional for leadership. So that means you do not have to be male to perceive the world through the male gaze. In the same way, you do not have to be white identifying to perceive and adopt the white gaze. Okay, let's define it bluntly, and then later we'll get a little more nerdy about it. Let's say that the white gaze assumes the superiority of white folks. And the white gaze assumes that if white folks are superior, everyone else should assimilate to white social norms. The white gaze says certain racialized folks can never just do things appropriately. This sets up a circular logic. Since whiteness is superior, that means everything and everybody else is lacking or deficient or inferior in comparison to white social norms. Therefore, white social norms should be the norms for everyone. Put all together, the behaviors of imaginary, perfect, idealized white folks, not real white folks, but imaginary, perfectly behaved white folks who speak perfect English, those imaginary perfect folks are positioned as the standard everyone should try to live up to. Up next, we're going to analyze 3 examples. The first example will focus on the white gaze specifically. The second and third examples focus on the white listening subject who perceives the world through the white gaze. So as mentioned, the white gaze perspective is inherited from history. So let's start with a historical event that I have always seen interpreted through the white gaze. Let's look at the legend of the Battle of the Alamo. Okay, so I grew up in South Texas, and part of our Texas history classes, we cover this supposedly major battle called the Battle of the Alamo that happened in San Antonio, where we supposedly got the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo."
Remember this battle! Remember the Alamo! Yeah! Is it him?
One of the bad guys in this story is this evil man, this infamous Mexican general Santa Anna, who eventually killed and slaughtered all the Texas soldiers. When this historical event was taught to me, it felt like an American legend, where you imagine this final last cowboy dude that's shooting his guns at the dirty Mexicans, going down in this patriotic blaze of glory, right? And his last words were like, "Remember the Alamo," and then he gets, shot a bunch of times or something.
What's your name?
I can't remember.
Can't you remember anything?
I remember the Alamo.
But, as a Mexican American kid in a 99% Mexican American school, I always felt really weird about that presentation, mainly because the Mexicans were always the bad guys. I was taught that Santa Anna was this barbaric warlord that indiscriminately killed everyone. Maybe not, but let's analyze this legend a little bit closer. One way people talk about the white gaze in public is with the phrase, "What is white is right." Parentheses, appropriate. For now, let's put how you might personally feel about that phrase to the side, and I invite you to think of this phrase as one central ideological belief of the white gaze perspective. A central belief where lots of other white supremacist beliefs come from. When it comes to recounting history, this racist perspective says, the white gaze interpretation of events is right, meaning authoritative, correct, appropriate, and therefore superior, etc. What is white is right. Now, the public school interpretation of the Battle of the Alamo story is a perfect example of the white gaze, a mode of perception that assumes what is white is right. As a kid, I was told over and over that the Texans were the heroes. They were the martyrs, and we must always remember the Alamo. But if you look a bit deeper, you learn that the Mexicans were trying to prevent the expansion of slavery into Texas. So to be very clear, Mexico was the anti-slavery side of the battle, while Texas was the pro-slavery side of the battle. But you know what? My school teachers in Texas, not one ever emphasize that part. I don't even remember learning that. We only talked about the white Texan heroes versus the cruel, barbaric, dirty Mexicans. Because again, what is white is right, at least to the white gaze. Clearly, the Remember the Alamo legend is told from the perspective of the white gaze, where whiteness is assumed correct and modern, even when it's defending and literally spreading freaking slavery. White supremacy is tricky like that. It will literally spin white supremacy into white heroism. So yeah, remember the Alamo. Or how about remember the Alamo was about white people spreading slavery? Put that on a fucking t-shirt. Okay, now let's complexify the visual gaze metaphor that is implied in the phrase the white gaze. Because remember, the white gaze is a point of view a person might take to see the world from or interpret the world from. And next, let's begin considering that the white gaze not only has eyes to see you, but also ears to hear you or ears to listen to you. When we talk about the ears of the white gaze, we are referring to the act of listening, all while comparing to idealized white linguistic norms. And, for example, if what is being listened to is assumed to be lacking grammatical correctness or lacking a white American accent, we find ourselves right back in that deficiency perspective again. Which makes sense because remember, the only way for whiteness to always be superior is to claim that everything else is deficient or lacking in comparison. So next we analyze a real-life example where the ears of the white gaze are used to listen to non-white folks speaking, while always assuming those non-white folks are doing something wrong or incorrect or inappropriate, such as not sounding American enough because of their Mexican accent. In Deep South Texas, where it's always been majority Mexican and Mexican American folks, well, there was this local university named Pan American College. And in the 60s and 70s, this college would line up all the students on registration day, have them speak out loud to a professor or an administrator. And if they were heard as having a Mexican accent, they were funneled into elementary and remedial speech classes to supposedly fix their inappropriate speech behaviors. In this case, having a Mexican accent meant that the speaker used an English that was supposedly too mixed with Spanish. Here's a question. If a student is said to have too much of something, is that still the deficiency perspective? Because isn't the deficiency perspective about not having enough of something or having a deficit? Let's think about how tricky the wording can be. When those folks claimed that the students had a Mexican accent that was too strong, we might get tricked into focusing on what is perceived as too much. But white supremacy is tricky like that. Sometimes it's phrased as having too much of something wrong, but really, what is really meant underneath is that there is not enough of something right. In this case, too much Mexican accent means not enough correct English. So the deficit perspective is still the ideological foundation underneath what was being said. Now here's one of the interesting parts. At this college, white identified students also took the speech tests. And remember, this was Texas. So many of these white students spoke with heavy Southern drawls. Yet, even then, white identified students passed the speech test and never had to take those remedial speech classes. So what was happening here? Well, we can say that those professors and administrators were listening to an accent through the white gaze, where the assumption is what is white is right. So those white students, those white speakers, were not heard as having anything wrong with their accent. In fact, they might have been heard as simply speaking English correctly, period, the end. But the Mexican students, on the other hand, They were heard as having an accent that needed to be fixed. And this is where we can explicitly begin talking about the white listening subject, which is a social position an actor might occupy, where the actor listens for deficiency through constant comparison to idealized white linguistic norms. Let me phrase that a couple different ways so that we make sure that we get it. If you are listening from the perspective of the white gaze, you are acting as a white listening subject. You are occupying the social position of the white listening subject. You are fulfilling the role of the white listening subject. In this example, Mexicans were seen as having a linguistic deficiency because of accent, because they sounded too Mexican. Yet the white students' accents were assumed appropriate for college, because what is perceived as white becomes perceived as right. That means those professors and administrators were making judgments based on the ideological beliefs of the white gaze. Or again, using my favorite vocabulary word from this article, we can say that those professors and administrators were working as white listening subjects. They were enacting a political position in society that is literally listening, judging, and then assuming white linguistic behaviors are correct, while non-white linguistic behaviors are inferior, or broken, or lacking, or deficient, and in need of some kind of remedial elementary training to learn how to talk right. Or maybe we should say, to learn how to talk white. And now for the final twist to this story. Some of those white listening subjects were actually Latino professors who also said those Mexican students needed elementary speech classes. If you want to know more about this story, I got another video which frames this kind of deficiency perspective as a form of linguistic terrorism. Okay, let's stop messing around and see what our authors say about the white listening subject. As with the white gaze, the white listening subject should be understood not as a biographical individual, but as an ideological position and mode of perception that shapes our racialized society. So Flores and Rosa define the white listening subject not as an actual real biographical person, but as a political position a person takes when listening, a mode of perception informed by specific ideologies. So again, anyone, wittingly or unwittingly, can play the role of the white listening subject. Okay, so for our third and final example, let's look at the article where Flores and Rosa interpret a moment from someone else's research. So let's look at that story. So here we see a school teacher who occupied the role of the white listening subject while judging the linguistic practices of Black students. In this example, the teacher was complaining about students using the phrase they was, as in they was talking instead of they were talking. So this teacher that was interviewed reported that a major problem in this school is definitely like issues with standard English versus vernacular English. Like if there was like one of the few goals I had this year was to get kids to stop saying he was, she was. Okay, right here the researcher had to jump in because there isn't technically anything unusual about saying he was and she was, as in he was happy and she was happy. But the researcher could already kind of predict what the teacher was complaining about. The researcher clarifies that the teacher means they was, referring to the specific African-American English syntactic construction, for example, they was talking, and the teacher agrees, but then goes on to state that the problem is that students think phrases such as she was are correct. The teacher later states everything just was. Okay, so clearly this teacher hates the construction they was. And she keeps talking as if every time a Black student uses the word was, it's always wrong. Let's return to the first thing she points out. If there was like one of the few goals I had this year was to get kids to stop saying he was, she was. Okay, so this teacher, wittingly or unwittingly, presented he was and she was as errors in Black student talk. Now, clearly, there is nothing unusual about this grammatical construction. But to this teacher, everything just was. And here is, in my opinion, one of the most important points. Even if Black and brown students, or racialized students in general, attempt to talk like an idealized, perfect white speaker, even when producing regular ass phrases like he was and she was, it will not matter if the teacher is judging students from the perspective of the white gaze. It will still be heard as wrong. It will be listened to as wrong. In this case, the teacher, whether they know it or not, is occupying the position of the white listening subject. And the white listening subject is a mode of perception informed by white supremacist ideologies about language users. To this teacher, anytime they heard the word was coming from Black students, they were already listening for error, deficiency, brokenness, lack of linguistic knowledge, inferiority, everything that makes up the deficiency perspective. This is what the white listening subject does. But Dr. Mike, isn't the phrase they was actually grammatically incorrect? Isn't it actually in error? That's a good question with a simple answer. It depends on which version of English you believe is the grammatically correct one, and then whether or not you think that that version of English should be enforced as the correct version in American schools, which then makes that specific version of English the standard, making every other version of English, like Black English, non-standard, as always already potentially wrong. Now quickly, for the phrase they was, there's already like 1 billion books explaining how Black English has just as many grammar rules as any other version of English, which means that in Black English, you absolutely cannot just put the word was anywhere. Yet we got this teacher claiming that to Black students, everything just was. So why does this teacher think this way? Well, at some point, perhaps this teacher misunderstood something. Or maybe they were just convinced to think that certain versions of English lack real grammar systems. Or maybe they were taught to listen in specific ways in their teacher training program. Notice how we inherit these ideologies about race and language. That is, we inherit raciolinguistic ideologies from our own racist political eras, as well as previous racist political eras. And one more major thing to notice about this work. We aren't really focusing on the speaker, or whether or not the speaker actually made a mistake. We also aren't focusing on whether or not Black English is actually real English. Like I said, there's 1 billion books talking about that already. What we are really focusing on here are the listeners. This includes teachers like the one we just talked about, who was constantly listening for what needed to be fixed, listening for deficiencies and errors and deviations from supposedly perfect, idealized white linguistic norms. This could also include, for example, a school principal who listens as a white listening subject and then perceives some students as deserving extra resources while perceiving other students as lacking intelligence or lacking motivation to do well in school. Or what about the white listening subject who works as the school police officer, who automatically hears a lack of respect when Black students start talking? And now that officer can't wait to violently fix that perceived lack of respect. So you see, this brings up a serious problem. In the United States, fixing linguistic problems in specific racialized speakers has been a primary goal in American education and language learning. However, if a teacher is constantly employing the deficiency perspective, constantly working as a white listening subject, there will always be one more broken thing to fix. Toni Morrison, a super famous author and theorist of the white gaze, explained how this exact white supremacist perspective works. Let's listen.
A very serious function of racism which is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and so you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says that you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, and so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing.
The deficiency perspective will always find one more thing to complain about or to want to fix in racialized speakers. And at the end of the day, even when a racialized speaker talks in the exact same way as an imaginary perfect white speaker, they might still be heard as wrong or incorrect. As our authors state, linguistic stigmatization should be understood less as a reflection of objective linguistic practices than of perceptions that construe appropriateness based on a speaker's racial position. In other words, and to rephrase a little bit, stigma emerges less from what racialized speakers actually do with language, what we can empirically observe, but more so emerges from our inherited raciolinguistic ideological beliefs that racialized speakers are always already deficient, always already doing something inappropriate before they even open their mouths. So, to wrap up our discussion for today, we went through 3 examples. First, the story of the Alamo, told from the perspective of the white gaze, where white is right, no matter what. And because white is right, white ways of doing things become the model for everyone else, including the way we use language. Next, we analyzed a college speech test where Mexican students were heard as speaking broken English, while white students with Southern drawls were never penalized, meaning the white listening subjects who were administering this test could only hear incorrectness and inappropriateness in specific racialized speakers, in the Mexican speakers. And finally, we looked at the teacher who was working as a white listening subject who assumed black students could not use the word was correctly. Notice that if we were all to reject the white gaze interpretation of stuff, we would not only be better historians and researchers, we would be better school leaders and administrators and teachers. Today we focused on the white listening subject and only hinted at what raciolinguistic ideologies are. On a basic level, yes, they are beliefs about race and language at the same time. But there's a lot of other really deep stuff going on that's kind of easy to miss. Like when they talk about the co-naturalization of the terms race and language. Like what does that mean? Well, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as usual, you can support this channel through Patreon. This is Dr. Mike with The Social Life of Language. And we're done.